Let's bring in former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Rattner. He's got charts looking at how much Iran stands to gain from Trump's deal. Steve, how much are we talking about?
Yeah, well, you guys kind of did the charts for me, but let me show you the numbers behind what you just said, because the point is exactly right. This deal is clearly worse for Americans than the Obama deal, and in other respects, certainly no better. But to Joe's point, so we've already taken sanctions off of Iranian oil during this negotiating period, not something Obama did. That is estimated to bring them $6 billion of extra oil revenue. In addition, we've committed during this period, before there's anything signed, to unfreeze $12 billion of Iranian assets, something that Obama never did. So $18 billion they get just for signing the MOU, so to speak. And then if you get a final deal, they have another $66 billion of frozen assets, and that's more than Obama. I'll show you that in a second. And and over the 2.3 years, which is equivalent to how long the JCPOA was in effect, they get another $66 billion of extra oil revenue. And then lastly, there's this $300 billion fund that Trump has been talking about. Nobody knows who's going to pay for it, whether the U.S. will be part of it, but it's potentially another big thing. So you can see here, in terms of the oil revenue, this is simply a breakdown of that. And it shows you the difference between, over the next couple of years, between what they would have gotten for their oil and what they will now get for their oil. Again, a total of another $78 billion or thereabouts.
So, Steve, to set up your next chart, let's first listen to the recent claim from President Trump about how much money he says the Obama administration gave to Tehran.
Obama flew a Boeing 757, a plane I know very well. They took the seats out and they loaded it up with $1.7 billion in cash from the banks in Maryland and Virginia and D.C. They emptied out the banks, and they gave them 1.7 in green, and they gave them tens of billions of dollars, just kept giving them money, and it didn't work.
All right, Steve, let's fact check that. What can you tell us about how Trump's deal with Iran compares to that previous agreement under Obama?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that $1.7 billion because that's particularly interesting. But before we do that, so obviously Obama had a final deal. Trump is still dealing with an interim framework. Obama had broad support in the international community. Trump, it's just the U.S. versus Iran. And then we get to this oil sanctions issue. Obama only lifted them after the agreement was signed and there was some verification of compliance beginning. Trump has already done part of it, as we said, has lifted the sanctions for now during the 60 period. Obama freed up no money up front. Trump is in the process right now of giving them $12 billion. Ultimately, Obama unsanctioned $50 billion of assets. Trump, we're talking about $78 billion of assets. So here's this $1.7 billion that Trump loves to talk about. What that is money that Iran put on deposit before the 1979 revolution for some purchases that were never made, and it's been frozen since then. And that's all that is essentially giving them back money they gave us 47 years ago. And then you have this rebuild fund, which we don't know who's going to pay for it, but potentially $300 million. And then, of course, as David Ignatius can explain better, Obama had all of the inspections and the snapback, and Trump, they've been going back and forth, but there doesn't seem to be certainly any agreement on the Iranians' part to agree to what they did under Obama. So when you add it all up, you can see that Obama provided $117 billion in total relief once they signed the final JCPOA, and Trump is actually giving them a little bit more than that in both crude oil sales and in unfrozen assets, not to mention the $300 billion that's floating around out there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Steve, because the number is so shockingly high, you accidentally said $300 million the first time you talked about it, and so if people were driving in their car, I'm sure now that they've heard it is $300 billion, they'll probably spill their coffee. But it really is remarkable. Yeah, $1.7 billion versus about $500 billion at the end of the day. I mean, it's just absolutely astounding. Talk about your third chart. You mentioned that $300 billion, well, I call it's a reparations fund, actually. It's just like the Germans had to pay at Versailles, except the $300 billion that we are going to be guaranteeing the Iranians is more than than what Kaiser Wilhelm II had to agree to at Versailles in 1919. And this is a key provision of the MOU. He keeps saying no money for the fund's going to come from U.S. taxpayers, the American government.
Let's hear him say it.
Okay, well, we'll hear him say it, and of course, the Iranians have already said
here's what he told
it's not true.
reporters at the G7 summit.
Well, it's been reported that it includes a $300 billion reconstruction fund funded by Gulf allies. That's false?
It's false. People, you can invest if you want. I mean, what am I going to do? Say nobody's ever allowed to invest? No, we're not investing. We're not putting up 10 cents. And people can decide to do that, but that's up to them. I mean, do you want me to say nobody's ever allowed to invest in a country? We are not investing in it, and we do not have a fund.
Steve, you say U.S. taxpayers are going to be on the hook here. And, of course, since the MOU has the United States guaranteeing this $300 billion, anybody that knows anything about treaties or knows anything about, well, basic contract law knows that if you guarantee the $300 billion, you're on the hook. Walk us through it.
Well, let's talk about the total costs of the war, because, again, the differences between what Trump is saying and what's going to happen are phenomenal. So far, the Pentagon has put the cost of this war at only $29 billion. But yesterday, they asked for another $80 billion in defense money. So obviously, this is a ridiculous number. There are a bunch of private forecasts out there that go anywhere from $132 billion, but they go all the way up to $1 trillion for this war. And again, this doesn't even include necessarily the $300 billion with a B for that fund, but it includes all sorts of other costs like veterans benefits, interest on the extra debt that we're going to accumulate, rebuilding American facilities overseas that have been damaged in this war. So what has been talked about as a $29 billion war could end up being a $1 trillion war, which is very similar to what happened in Iraq. And then I want to just make one last point, which is in terms of collateral damage, so to speak. We unfroze, or we allowed Russia to charge full market price for its oil during this period while the war was going on to get oil into the world economy. And the consequence of that is that the Russians got $22 billion more in oil revenue than they would have gotten had the cap on their oil price that we imposed on stayed in place. And so inadvertently, or as I said, as collateral damage, the Russians now have $22 billion more to fight Ukraine with.
David, when you see these numbers, I mean, up to potentially, according to Harvard, $1 trillion for the war, you see the polling showing that the war is unpopular, and yet the White House's calculation is that people are not going to really look at the details of all of the charts that Steve has produced for us this morning. All they're going to look at is the price of filling up their car when they pass by the petrol pump. Do you think Trump will pay a political price in the long run for what has been something of a fiasco for America?
I do. The polling is pretty clear that the country isn't comfortable with having gone to war in Iran, doesn't see the benefits. Trump, let's not forget, was elected as the candidate who was going to stop these wars in the Middle East, would pull back from these adventures, and I think it's really going to cost him at the polls in November. It's going to cost the Republicans for some time now. People simply don't believe that the benefits are real. We've talked about the $300 billion that might be part of this cost. We should remember that's on paper. I mean, in a sense, it'd be nice if there was a clear plan to actually spend money and have a plan for a different Iran. There isn't. I mean, that's a notional fund. Saudis have said they're not going to put money into it. The Emiratis, the same thing. But I think in terms of public perceptions, this is going to be seen as a war like Iraq, like Afghanistan, where we spent a lot and got a little.
Yeah, I mean, this data that Steve's put together is pretty comprehensive and thorough and convincing, but has he considered Trump's counterargument that it was a great war? No. Okay. I agree with David. I think this is problematic for Trump politically. And honestly, we're in Chapter 1, right? I mean, this is a 60-day MOU. There's tons of negotiations that's still to be done. The first 3 days have been interesting, to be honest with you, because we have declarations from the American side. that are within 12 hours refuted by the Iranian side, everything from the Strait of Hormuz to the IAEA inspectors. I think, and with stipulation that Americans don't always rarely vote on foreign policy, I do think that we're going to have another inflection point when a deal has to be announced. Because at that point, you can't really continue to, I mean, you're going to try, but you can't really continue to spin the specifics. Right now, Trump can say, well, this is just to get us to a point of conversation, or J.D. Vance could say that. But at a certain point, the Iranians will get the money. They'll do stuff with it that we probably don't like. We'll know if the Strait of Hormuz is being tolled or not. The oil tankers will have to pay it. And I think the American public will say, fully and formally, was this worth it? And as of now, every polling data indicates that they don't believe it was worth it.
The one that we showed this morning showed only 25% of Americans think it was worth it. I will say, for all of those who love to say, oh, Americans don't vote on foreign policy, I will just remind them, Joe Biden was over 50% in his presidency until the fiasco in Afghanistan, that fiasco of withdrawal. Then he dropped below 50%. Go back to 2004, Republicans win the White House. Karl Rove talks about a permanent majority. Iraq goes sideways. 2 years later, in 2006, Nancy Pelosi becomes the first woman to be Speaker of the House, and the Democrats are swept into power. So much for that permanent majority. Why did it go? Because of Iraq. Why did Joe Biden go below 50% for good? Because of Afghanistan. So to think that only 25% of the people support this war and think we won this war, and you have the numbers that Steve's showing, that the MOU says that we're going to give them up to $500 billion, the Iranians, that's just politically toxic.